when you think through this whole Joseph story, I think one of the perplexing issues or the questions that runs through our minds throughout the story is like, what is Joseph doing? Like, why is he doing what he's doing? What's he trying to figure out with his brothers? What's he putting them through, and why is he doing it? What's he after, right? But now that he has heard Judah's amazing speech where he's offering to give up himself for Joseph's younger brother Benjamin, as Joseph has now realizing the transformation that God has been doing and carrying out, especially in Judah, we have to think, is Joseph really going to be able to keep the secret anymore? When's he going to tell them the truth? And we come to Genesis 45, verse 1, and we realize the time has come. 45:1, Joseph could not control himself. He sends everybody else out, except for these guys. Remember, they don't know who this is. And then Joseph just starts weeping, and you can only imagine what they're thinking. Like, what is this leader of Egypt thinking? And Judah, this seems to be in response to his speech. Why is he crying over this? And then Joseph tells them. Genesis 45, verse 3. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? And they can't say anything. They can't answer him. They can't even get any words out, because the text says they're dismayed at his presence. That's got to be an incredible understatement, right? They're dismayed. They cannot handle the truth. I'm Joseph. Is my dad still alive? And they say nothing, so Joseph just has to go on. He comes close to them. Guys, I'm Joseph. Like you remember the one that you sold, your brother that you sold. That's me. It's me. And then look at what he says in 45:5. He says, now guys, don't be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And he talks about the famine. There's a lot longer to go, guys. But verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth. And verse 8, amazing. He's had years to think about this. And he says, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. I mean, think about that. These brothers had betrayed him in their hatred. They had tried to get rid of him. They had all of their evil purposes in mind. But Joseph now sees, it was not you who sent me here. It wasn't your purposes that were being carried out. God sent me. His purposes were being carried out, and it was to save you, brothers, and your family, our family. God sent me here to save and to preserve life. And he says, you got to go back and you got to tell Dad, tell him I'm alive and God's made me the Lord of all of Egypt. And then verse 14 of chapter 45, Joseph comes up to his brother Benjamin. I don't even know how old Benjamin was when Joseph was torn away. But you have to wonder if Benjamin really even remembers his brother, and Joseph just falls on him, hugs him, kisses him, and weeps, and Benjamin just starts weeping, and the brothers are reunited and embracing. And then Joseph goes to all the brothers and hugs them, kisses them, weeps over them, and with them they're reunited, and then they're finally able to talk with him when they see they're forgiven. He's not going to take revenge, and they're reunited. But then they got to go back. The brothers have to go home, and they have to tell their dad what they have kept hidden for all of these years. But on the other hand, they're going to tell their dad the good news about Joseph. And so they head home. You can imagine the trip home as they be wrestling with what they're going to say. And they get there in chapter 45, verse 26, and they just tell him, Dad, Joseph is still alive. And he's the ruler over all the land of Egypt. I mean, Jacob is an old man. He thought his son has been dead for years. And all of a sudden, Joseph is still alive, and he's the Lord of Egypt. Jacob's heart becomes numb because he cannot believe what his sons are saying. But then he looks at all the stuff that's been sent home, and it dawns on him, it's true, my son is still alive. And he said, I'm going to go, and I'm going to see him before I die. And then God appears to Jacob in Genesis 46, and God tells Jacob, that is an old man, says, Jacob, don't be afraid to go down. I'm going to make you into a great nation down there in Egypt. And look at 46, verse 4. God says, I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I'll bring you up again, and Joseph's hand will close your eyes. Wow, you think of the promises that God had made to Jacob all those years before, of blessing, but remember the promise of his presence. God guaranteed to Jacob, I will be with you wherever you go. And now here's Jacob as an old man. He's got one more journey to make. Down to Egypt, to see his son, and to die. And God says, I'm going to be with you, even to death. And so Jacob gathers everybody, the sons, all of their belongings, and they leave the land of Canaan to go down to Egypt, to be reunited with Joseph. And Jacob and Joseph are finally reunited. Jacob gets to meet his grandsons, Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh the older, Ephraim the younger. And it's an incredible reunion. By chapter 48, verse 1, though, Jacob is sick. He's an old man. He's ill. The time of his death is approaching. And so he gets together with his son Joseph and with his grandsons. And I want you to look at what Jacob says to Joseph. This is chapter 48, verse 15, when he's blessing Joseph and really blessing Joseph's sons. 48, verse 15. He blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long, to this day. I mean, think about that. That right there is the first time in the Bible that God is pictured as the shepherd of his people. And it comes out of the mouth of Jacob. He's an old man, and his life has been a mess in so many ways, so many ups and downs, bearing so many consequences for his foolish decisions, being hurt and suffering so much. And yet he says to his son and to his grandsons, oh son, the God who has been my shepherd all the days of my life, who's been with me, leading me, guiding me, protecting me, feeding me, the God who's been my shepherd, may he bless you, may he bless these boys. And it's interesting, just something to note, that Manasseh and Ephraim, Jacob doesn't bless them the way that we would expect. He blesses the youngest, Ephraim, over the oldest, Manasseh. God has his plans that he's working out. But it's an incredible reunion. And now Jacob, before he dies, doesn't want to just meet with these sons, or his son and grandsons. He wants to meet with all his sons. And so we come to Genesis 49, one of the most important chapters in all of Genesis. Chapter 49, Jacob's an old man. He knows he's about to die. And so he gathers all the boys, all the sons, to speak to each one about what will happen in the latter days. And one of the things that we've been picking up throughout Genesis is that the last words of the characters seem to be really important, almost prophetic. And here's Jacob specifically saying now to the boys, I want to tell you what will happen in the latter days. And he's going to go around from son to son. And so he starts with Reuben in Genesis 49, verse 3. Remember, everybody's present. And he says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power, unstable as water. You will not have preeminence because you went up to your father's bed and then you defiled it. Remember what Reuben had done with one of the maids that Jacob had relationships with. And then it looks like at the end of verse 4, imagine this, the last thing your dad says about you. He looks at all the brothers, it seems, and he says, Reuben went up to my couch and defiled it. Reuben will not have the preeminence. And then he goes to Simeon and Levi, the second and third. And he remembers their anger in what they did to the people of Shechem. And he says, cursed be their anger. I will divide them and scatter them. But then he comes to Judah in verse 8. And look at what he says. 49:8. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as a lioness, who dares rouse him? And then Jacob says, the scepter, like the king's ruling staff, will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him will be the obedience of the peoples. Judah, this is what will happen in the latter days. Kings are going to come from you, Judah, and there will come a king to whom the peoples will bring their obedience. The scepter will never depart from you, Judah. I think kings have been promised. A conquering seed has been promised. And now we know where to look. And surprise, surprise, it's not in Joseph's line. It's in Judah's line that the scepter will never depart. God will raise up a king who will rule not just over his brothers, but who will rule over the peoples. The scepter won't depart until someone arises to whom the peoples will bring their obedience. And then Jacob goes through the rest of the blessings. He blesses Joseph as well in verses 22 and following. And then you get to the end of chapter 49. And Jacob is about to die. And he talks about where he wants to be buried. And he doesn't want to be buried down in Egypt. He wants to be buried back with his fathers. And he wants to be buried back with Leah. Which is an interesting thing. Not with Rachel, but back with Leah. The one who had been not honored in life seems to be honored in death. And then chapter 50. Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him because Jacob has died. Well, after this, the brothers, they fear that after their father is dead, that Joseph is going to turn on them, that maybe it wasn't true forgiveness. And Joseph tells them, look guys, don't worry. Don't worry. Chapter 50, verse 19. Joseph said to them, don't fear, for am I in the place of God? Is it to me to take vengeance? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Don't fear. And then the book of Genesis ends with Joseph saying, I'm about to die, but God will visit you, and he'll bring you up out of this land, back to the land that he swore to Abraham. God will surely visit you, and you will carry up my bones from here. I don't want to be buried down here either. I know God will do what he's promised our fathers. So don't leave my bones down here. I want them to be taken home to the land of Canaan, back to the promised land. Now, if you step back and you think of this story from chapter 37 to 50, the longest single story, I think, in the whole book of Genesis, right? It's the story of Joseph, and we've seen how God has been working in Joseph's life, how God has been with Joseph. But under the story, we have been seeing another story. The story of the transformation of Judah. From an immoral man, a man who sold his brother into slavery, into a man who would give up his life for his brothers. And by the end, we see, surprise, surprise, that it will not be through Joseph's line that God will raise up the king who will rescue us. But no, it will be through the line of Judah that God will raise up a lion, a leader, a king who will be able to crush the serpent's head and take us back to the way things used to be. You see, God has used Joseph, a man of great wisdom and character, who exercised dominion to save the line, to save his brothers who had hated him and despised him and betrayed him. And Joseph will forever be remembered for his faithfulness to God and how God used him to save the line. But the one that God will ultimately use to save us will not be Joseph, or even from Joseph's line, but rather from the tribe of Judah. In other words, God used Joseph to save the line, but God wants to use Judah and his line to save the world. It will be a lion from the tribe of Judah who will arise and who will be able to win the battle that began all the way back in Genesis 3.